The Nibbleheim incident was an extremely significant event in Final Fantasy VII that had far-reaching consequences, not only for the characters involved, but also regarding the entire plot of the compilation itself. This was a defining moment for both our protagonist Cloud and our primary antagonist Sephiroth. For a variety of reasons, however, it's not easy to discern these events. Firstly, because they are delivered in the game initially through unreliable narrator Cloud, and secondly, because across the compilation we do have some conflicting details, depending on which source we look at. The events of the Nibelheim incident are detailed in the original Final Fantasy VII, in Crisis Core, and in Before Crisis and Last Order. We also see the Nibelheim incident being referred to in Final Fantasy VII Remake, in the novella The Kids Are Alright, a Turk's side story, in Dirge of Cerberus, in Advent Children, in The Maiden Who Travels the Planet, and in A Trace of Two Pasts to date. In this video, we're going to explore exactly what happened during the fateful Nibelheim incident in as much detail as possible, pulling from all of the available sources. All of this technically began around 2,000 years ago, but for the sake of simplicity, we'll begin in August of the year 2, when President Shinra had been informed that there was an ongoing situation at the Nibelheim reactor, whose employees had disappeared. The president was very eager for this situation to be dealt with as a matter of urgency, because of the Nibelheim's reactor's significance as Shinra's first reactor, and because it housed a noteworthy Shinra secret. This, of course, was Jenova. Nibbleheim is a small mountain town located at the base of Mount Nibble on the western continent of Gaia, and the concerning reports President Shinra received here regarding Nibelheim were not the first moment in the timeline that this place had come into the frame. As far back as 1977, sketchy stuff was already going on there, such as the Jenova Project S and G, the creation therefore of Sephiroth, the experimentation on Vincent Valentine, and the experimentation on Elf, to mention but a few. Despite how modest and humble Nibbleheim itself seems, the fact that the Shinra Electric Power Company chose this place to house its first ever Mako reactor is definitely interesting. This is also the location of the Shinra Mansion or Manor, which was built before the town was established. The manor is now a derelict house of grandeur, within which many nefarious experiments have been carried out over the years. And so the question is, why here? Is this place special or important? In some way, perhaps? In The Kids Are Alright, Chapter 39, Nibelheim, Sung explains that the area is rich in Mako, which is why the location was chosen. Upon first arriving in Nibelheim, Sephiroth commented that the Mako smell is really bad there, even in the village, which is quite a distance from the reactor itself. And this, along with a few other details, reinforces what Sung claims. It could be that this area is like a livestream hotspot, in a similar way to Medil and Benora. But the concentration of Mako here could be present because this is where the Shinra scientists chose to house Jenova. We know the planet has measures in place to prevent Jenova from causing any more harm than it already has, so it would make sense for this to be a place that the planet would want to be keeping a close eye on. The idea that there may be more to Nibelheim than meets the eye comes up regarding conversations about Cloud Strife and how he was able to beat Sephiroth at all during the events that we're going to cover here. This also stems back to an incident around 1995 when both Cloud and Tifa Lockhart fell from a suspension bridge as children while climbing Mount Nibble. As a result of this accident, Tifa was badly injured, in a coma for a week, whereas Cloud himself only suffered superficial injuries, namely scraped knees. It's been theorized that Cloud has strength that is unexplained and certainly unusual, and this may be because he experienced some kind of life stream or Mako intervention during this event. Cloud, of course, was born in Nibbleheim along with Tifa. Cloud's unexplained strength, of course, could have been passed down by his parents. In the Tifa chapter of A Trace of Two Pasts, which hasn't officially been translated yet, we discover that Cloud's mother, Claudia, was a rebellious type when she was younger, and she took in a rather handsome traveller, a man described as like the wind, who could not stay in one place for too long, who would become Cloud's father. It's recounted that one day he left the house to explore the mountain and simply never came back, and it's presumed that the monsters got him, and this is all we know. We digress, however, back to Nibbleheim. On September the 21st of the year 2, as per President Shinra's orders, the Turks were sent to investigate the disappearance of the workers at the Nibbleheim reactor. The guards, scientists and workers stationed there had suddenly stopped reporting back to HQ. The reactor had gone dark, either having been shut down or malfunctioned in some way. It was theorized by the Turks that the missing workers may have fallen victim to an accident at the reactor due to structural disrepair, since this was Shinra's oldest reactor. Shinra suspected foul play from either Genesis, the defected Soldier First Class, or Lazard, the disgraced director of Soldier and illegitimate son of President Shinra. They found Mount Nibble to be a cold and unforgiving place. After various struggles, they arrived at the reactor to discover the area around the entrance had become a nest for a whole bunch of dangerous monsters, including dragons, and they realized that they were going to need to bring in the big guns for this mission, Soldier. A secret ropeway had been erected by Shinra to allow employees to travel between the reactor and the town, but this was destroyed by the dragons, which meant only those who were familiar with the mountain trail would know how to get to the reactor, and so the Turks employed a local, Tifa Lockhart, as the guide for the mission. In A Trace of Two Pasts, Tifa remembers that there was quite a buzz around town, and that the ladies from the village had worked to provide food for all of the people that were coming and going during this time, and all of this was despite the fact that the villagers themselves were fearful of the recent surge of monsters in the area. Tifa herself was also very excited to learn that Shinra would be sending soldier operatives because she hoped that her childhood friend Cloud would be among them, since he left Nibbleheim 2 years earlier, telling her he was going to join Soldier to be like the great war hero Sephiroth. When Sephiroth and Zack arrived, however, most of the villagers kept their distance behind locked doors and closed shutters. The Shinra soldiers did represent hope that the monster problem would be solved, but they also bred concern and suspicion. While the Turks were scouting the area, Zack Fair was visiting Aerith Gainsborough in the Sector 5 slums in Midgar, building her a wagon from which she could sell her flowers. Sung of the Turks informed Zack that he had been recalled for a mission at Nibbleheim. Zack told Aerith that the job would be easy, and he would be back in no time. Before he left, however, he asked Sung to protect Aerith while he was gone, explaining that Sung was the only one that he could depend on. While in the life stream, in The Maiden Who Travels the Planet, Zack explained to Aerith that lots of things happened, all terrible things. It all started when I was dispatched on a mission to the rural Nibbleheim. At Shinra HQ, Zack was briefed by Sephiroth on the assignment and learned that his friend Cloud would be accompanying them. The Turks reported that, along with the disappearance of the reactor workers, legions of monsters had spawned in the area, and so Soldier had now been tasked with leading the investigation team. It's during this conversation that Sephiroth tells Zack that, depending on what happens in Nibbleheim, he had been considering leaving Shinra. And this demonstrates that Sephiroth was already growing disillusioned with Shinra before they went to Nibbleheim. Throughout the events of Crisis Core, we do see a great deal of tension building within Sephiroth as he discovers more information regarding the Genova Project S. When Genesis was injured during a training session in late summer of the year 0, while Sephiroth, Angeal and Genesis were all first-class soldiers together, he volunteered himself as a blood donor and, much to his confusion, was told that he was not viable. Both of his friends, Genesis and Angeal, had in the last couple of years deserted Soldier, and he didn't understand why, and he also perceived this as a personal betrayal. Sephiroth then discovered confidential reports stolen by Dr. Hollander regarding Project G and the Ancients Project, and after the Shinra building was attacked, he locked himself away in the data room, researching the history of the Shinra Science Department. It's clear from Crisis Core that Sephiroth had already begun questioning his identity long before Nibbleheim. Zack and Cloud met several months after Cloud had joined Shinra while on an assignment in Nibelheim. During his time with Shinra, Cloud failed to make the cut as a soldier, and had no choice but to settle as a lowly infantryman. The Final Fantasy VII Ultimania Omega explains that potential soldier candidates had to undergo many examinations, and should they pass these tests, they would then be bathed in Mako energy to enhance their physical abilities, similar to the Magitech Knights of Final Fantasy VI. Many, however, became physically and mentally ill, causing several deaths, and this was all, of course, covered up by Shinra. Only a handful graduated, making them an elite few. In one of the loading tip screens in Final Fantasy VII Remake, it is explained that Soldier are a set of elite troops assigned to Shinra's Public Security Division. Those who pass Soldier's rigorous screening tests are bathed in Mako to further enhance their physical capabilities. Units are assigned one of 3 ranks depending on aptitude, but even soldiers in the lowest rank, which would be 3rd class, are not to be underestimated. It is implied, but never confirmed, that Cloud failed the initial screening due to his mental instability, and therefore he never got as far as the Mako infusion part of the process. In the original continuity, during their stop in Kalm, Cloud recounted to the group the journey from Midgar to Nibelheim on September the 22nd with Sephiroth. However, due to his Genova/Mako-induced memory merge with Zack, this story definitely doesn't add up. Cloud explains that he and Sephiroth were war buddies before this, even friends. But this was Zack's memory of Sephiroth and not Cloud's. In fact, this was the first time that Cloud had met Sephiroth. On the way, Zack lamented that he joined Soldier so that he could be like Sephiroth, but by the time he made it to first class, the Wutai War, was already over, and this is why he always signed up for missions, in an attempt to prove himself. Cloud's memory of this conversation and others would later contribute towards creating his new persona. En route, they encountered a dragon which Sephiroth swiftly dealt with. This is another contradiction with Cloud's disjointed memories, and a hint that things are not adding up, because he explained to the party that he was mesmerized by the way that Sephiroth fought. But he had just told them that they were friends. War buddies, in fact, indicating that he should have already known well how strong Sephiroth was. But then he presents this as though it was the first time he'd seen Sephiroth in action, which is in fact the truth. By the time they arrived in Nibbleheim, Sephiroth had clearly made some small talk with Cloud, even though he was just a grunt compared to the legendary first-class soldier Sephiroth. Enough, at least, for Sephiroth to know that Nibbleheim was Cloud's hometown, since he says as much and tells him that he can go and visit his family and friends if he likes. Sephiroth wasn't always the way we see him in Final Fantasy VII. He was cold and somewhat aloof, but he was also professional, calm, collected and in control, well-spoken and graceful, with a dry sense of humour. He had no interest in personal glory, as he tells Genesis, who envies Sephiroth's reputation, that he can have it. It makes sense that even though Cloud would have been considered beneath him, that Sephiroth wasn't so arrogant that he wouldn't have made a little conversation along the way. Cloud, however, was extremely embarrassed at the idea of the people from his hometown, especially Tifa, discovering that he simply wasn't good enough to become a soldier. When Tifa greeted the investigation team and was introduced as their guide for the journey, Cloud kept his face covered by his helmet and asked the others to not reveal his identity to her. Tifa even asked Zack if any other members of Soldier aside from him and Sephiroth had been dispatched on this mission, and she was clearly disappointed to be told that they were the only ones. It is here that Sephiroth reveals in casual conversation that his mother, who he was told died shortly after his birth, was called Jenova. The group stayed the night at the inn and prepared to set off early the next day for the reactor. This gave Cloud a little time to go and visit his mother, Claudia. Here, his mother told him that she was very proud of the man that he had become. She fretted over whether he had been eating well or not. She reminded him of the temptations in the city and expressed her desire to see him settle down with the right woman. That evening in the inn, Sephiroth commented to Zack that the place felt strangely familiar to him. The Final Fantasy VII Anniversary Ultimania confirms that Sephiroth's birthplace was Nibbleheim, although since he had been lied to by Shinra his entire life, he didn't know this. He was taken from his mother Lucrezia at birth and raised by Shinra to be their super soldier. Shinra told him nothing about his true parentage, except that his mother's name was Jenova. Interestingly, the location of Lucrezia's cave is just behind the mountains here. Sephiroth's real mother resides close by in her self-imposed exile, and she has been there for over 20 years. Early on the morning of September the 23rd, the investigation team met with Tifa at the edge of town, where a local photographer took a picture of Zack, Sephiroth and Tifa before they headed out. Tifa's father, Brian Lockhart, the village chief of Nibelheim, was most unhappy that his daughter had been recruited to act as a guide for the investigation team, and he warned them to protect her. Cloud was, of course, there too, in his Shinra uniform complete with helmet, and as promised, Zack kept Cloud's identity to himself and Tifa was none the wiser. On the way, as expected, the terrain was indeed challenging, with several monsters which the team disposed of. One of the infantrymen was, however, lost when a rope bridge broke. It is implied at this point that Sephiroth was very eager to get to the reactor. He expressed irritation with Tifa's father and the photographer before they set out, a crack in his usually cool demeanour. And here he told the group that there was no time to search for their fellow officer. Closer to the reactor, they discovered a Mako fountain on the mountain trail, which Sephiroth explained is a very rare phenomenon, a miracle of nature, and the group receive a little materia tutorial, and Hojo is also mentioned. At the reactor, Cloud, still hiding behind his helmet, was ordered to stand guard and wait outside with Tifa, as non-Shinra personnel were not permitted inside the top-secret facility. Inside, Zack and Sephiroth discovered several strange pods, containment units holding machinoids, monsters, mutated humans produced by overexposure to Mako energy, and a locked chamber with a door marked Jenova. In Crisis Core, Sephiroth told Zack that you average soldier members are Mako-infused humans. You're enhanced, but still human. But then, what are those things? Their Mako energy levels are exponentially higher than yours. These have already been encountered by Zack since the Genesis army included machinoids, created in the Bonora underground, and the graffiti in their cells suggested they were indeed once human. And we see something similar in the Final Fantasy VII Remake underneath the fallen Sector 7 plate in the secret underground testing facility in the form of the unknown entities. They quickly discovered that the cause of the reactor's malfunction was a broken valve, which they fix. But this doesn't fully explain the disappearance of the reactor employees. At this point, however, they pretty much forget the primary goal of this investigation as other matters of a more personal nature took over. Zack was surprised to see the name Jenova above the sealed door, recalling that this was the name that Sephiroth claimed to be his mother. Sephiroth, extremely disturbed by the discoverers here, suffered a mental break of sorts. To Zack's concern, Sephiroth clutched at his head and staggered around, mumbling. Zack attempted to check on his colleague, but he was pushed away. We saw Cloud behave in a similar way throughout both the original game and in Remake, when he endured his Jenova-induced headaches. Sephiroth was beginning to piece together all the information he had discovered regarding how he came to be Jenova, Hojo, Soldier, Angeal, Genesis, Machanoids, and he was arriving at some distressing conclusions. As Sephiroth struggled with these revelations, one of the capsules broke open and a grotesque creature fell from it. A machanoid, screaming, shrieking in agony as it died on the floor of the chamber. Sephiroth realized it is possible that he was created in this same way, which of course called his entire identity into question. He couldn't even be sure if he was human anymore. In the original game, he said, "I've always felt, since I was small, that I was different from the others, special in some way, but not like this." He echoed these words in Crisis Core, and here is where the story of Nibbleheim deviates, depending on which version we explore. The inclusion of Genesis inside the reactor is only outlined in Crisis Core. None of the other iterations of the Nibelheim incident feature him. This is a change that many fans didn't appreciate so much, but despite how tacked on Genesis appearing at this moment seems to be, it can easily be worked into the narrative since Cloud Strife is such an unreliable narrator. If in doubt, fall back on the fact that Cloud's story is sus. Whether or not Genesis being there at this moment is truly canon or not, which it's kind of suggested it is, doesn't matter either way, since it didn't really change anything at all. Genesis, taking advantage of Sephiroth in a rare and vulnerable moment, goaded him, calling him a perfect monster. But it's indicated that Sephiroth reached this same conclusion with or without the assistance of Genesis, because all of the information that Genesis gives him regarding the Jenova project was soon found in the reports in the Shinra mansion anyway. Immediately after this, Sephiroth headed to the Shinra mansion, refusing to talk to anyone, and refusing to come out while he worked his way through the numerous reports regarding the Jenova project there. The Shinra mansion had been abandoned since 1985, after Professor Hojo tracked down Gast and Ifalna at the Icicle Inn, killed Gast and took Ifalna and their daughter Aerith to his laboratory in Shinra HQ in Midgar for experimentation. It seems that, with two ancients in his possession, Hojo had turned his attention to the study of the Cetra and, for the most part, at least temporarily, lost interest in the Jenova project. In the events of Before Crisis, 17 years later in Chapter 10, June of the year 2, Hojo's curiosity in the Jenova project was again piqued when he saw Sephiroth in action and realised just how strong his creation had become. This was only a few months ago, and so it's likely to have still been very much at the forefront of Hojo's mind. The fact Hojo wasn't even fully aware of the true extent of Sephiroth's strength before seeing it for himself really does indicate how much disinterest he had shown in his son, or his creation, however we want to view things. Sephiroth was undoubtedly impacted by the lack of parental figures during his childhood. He recalled Gast with fondness, but can only have been around 5 years old when Gast was killed, so it seems the only person who treated him with kindness during his childhood was gone very early on. Hojo was clearly uninterested in claiming Sephiroth as his own in any nurturing or paternal sense. Sephiroth's real mother, Lucrezia, traumatized by what had passed, had exiled herself inside the crystal cave. Being secure in one's own identity generally occurs during childhood, and we can see this is something Sephiroth never had access to. It's not implicitly stated or explored, but significant emotional neglect is implied. Sephiroth was treated like a commodity, a prized trophy for the Shinra company, and a propaganda tool during the Wutai War. Sephiroth's behaviour here was not out of character or out of the blue. It was heavily implied that he had been searching for information regarding all of this for quite some time, as indicated earlier in Crisis Core when he locked himself away in the data room at Shinra HQ, and the fact he had already told Zack that Nibbleheim might be his last mission with the company. There must have been so many questions racing around in Sephiroth's mind after discovering the mechanoids and the Genova chamber. His friends and peers in terms of physical prowess, Angeal and Genesis, had defected with hardly any explanation. Now apparently they both had wings and Genesis was physically degrading. Was Sephiroth going to suffer the same fate? The existence of Zack must have been reassuring for him. A normal human being able to reach the station of first-class soldier meant Sephiroth might not be like his friends after all. But who could he ask? Hojo? Hollander? The Turks? The Shinra executives? Director Lazard? Sephiroth is intelligent, but he would have been fully aware that secrets were being kept from him. But who he could ask and who he could trust was far less obvious. Nibbleheim felt familiar to him. We know he had early childhood memories, since he recalls Gast, and these reports probably confirmed to him that he was born in Nibelheim. Perhaps he even remembered the Shinra mansion after spending some time there. This could well have increased his rage towards his apparent hometown, full of people who turned a blind eye to what was going on inside the manor. Full of people who never once attempted to protect him. Full of people who lied to him. I have, of course, here been attempting to build a compelling case as to why it is Sephiroth chose to do what he was about to do, to lend a degree of understanding for the madness he encountered here. None of this, however, no matter how traumatic and terrible, is an excuse for genocide. In The Maiden Who Travels the Planet, Zack refers to it not as an incident, but as the huge Nibelheim massacre, and he's not wrong. However, the problem with the reports contained in the Shinra mansion is that they were never updated. These reports state that Genova, discovered and excavated from a 2,000-year-old stratum, was identified to be a Cetra, and that the Genova project's goal was to recreate one with the powers of the ancients, a human Cetra hybrid that would lead Shinra to the promised land. In fact, the super soldier thing was very much accidental, an accident that Shinra was more than willing to take full advantage of course. Professor Gast realised his mistake either just before or during his time at the Icicle Inn, where Ifalna informed him that Genova was not Cetra, but something else entirely, the calamity that fell from the skies. But Gast was never afforded the opportunity to return to the manor to update the files. Hojo abandoned the project upon the death of Gast, and seemingly had no interest in returning to clarify the mistakes contained in these reports either. The information regarding Genova that Sephiroth discovered here, therefore, was not the truth. The rest of the team, Zack, Cloud, the Turks, didn't know what to do, and so they waited, and days passed. Back at the inn, Cloud asked Zack what happened inside the reactor. Zack was reticent to give away the details. Sephiroth had refused to speak with him ever since they returned to town. He instead implied that it's a good thing that Cloud never made it into Soldier because it's a den of monsters. Over the next several days, Sephiroth remained inside the manor, despite Zack's attempts to reach out to him. He refused to come out. While they waited, Zack received a call from Aerith, where he explained to her that things had got a little complicated with the mission, and he promised he would see her soon. The villagers of Nibbleheim began to grow wary, concerned. Tifa's martial arts instructor Zangan and Tifa's father waited apprehensively outside the Shinra mansion, as though they were on guard in some way. Early on the 7th day, on October the 1st of the year 2, Zack once again went to check in on Sephiroth, but this day was different. For the first time since he entered the Shinra mansion, Sephiroth spoke to Zack, but his words were as shocking as they were confusing. Sephiroth told Zack he was ignorant and a traitor. He went on to outline that the planet originally belonged to an ancient nomadic race known as the Cetra. He explained that some of these disliked the nomadic way of life and built shelters and elected to live an easier life. That they took the planet's resources without giving back, and that these people were Zack's ancestors. He then outlined the calamity that came from the skies, and that when this happened, Zack's ancestors escaped and hid, leaving the true Cetra to sacrifice themselves to save them and the planet, and that all that is left of the Cetra now is only in the reports that he has read. He believed, from what he had read, that Genova was one of these Cetra, and he, being produced using her cells, meant that he was also Cetra. He then violently pushed past Zack, exiting the mansion, exclaiming he was going to see his mother. As we now understand, what Sephiroth speaks of here is a patchwork of truth and misinformation. It was certainly enough to make something inside of him snap. Zack chased after Sephiroth despite being injured and wasn't too far behind him, which means the destruction Sephiroth caused in the village was as swift as it was deadly. As Zack emerged, he was confronted by absolute horror. Sephiroth had set the entire village alight and slaughtered many villagers without mercy. Master Zangan was attempting rescue efforts. The ground was littered with bodies, and smoke and fire choked the air. Cloud lay injured outside his mother's house, and Cloud's mother was, sadly, already dead. Whether it was the fire that killed her, or she died by Sephiroth's Masamune, was never fully clear until it was heavily implied in Remake that Sephiroth killed her personally. In Chapter 2 of Final Fantasy VII Remake, when Cloud is subjected to a flashback of the fire at Nibbleheim, he sees an illusion of Sephiroth who tells him, "Run, Cloud, run away. You have to leave. You have to live." The Final Fantasy VII Remake Ultimania confirms that these were Cloud's mother's final words to Cloud, and that Sephiroth remembers them. Cloud, it would appear, had attempted to save his mother, but had failed. In Last Order, interestingly, Tifa's father, in his dying breath, says something weirdly similar. Run away and live. Sephiroth by this time had already begun making his way to the reactor. Tifa had gone after him, searching for her father, and Zack followed to save Tifa and to confront Sephiroth. Cloud followed shortly after this. Once again, this is where several details given across the compilation contradict each other, so we'll go through each of them. In the original Final Fantasy VII, Cloud told the party while recounting these events that of course it was him, and he failed to mention Zack at all. In the Kalm Flashback, the two are merged and confused, so this account is taken from the flashback in Cloud's memories at Medeal, which are meant to be the actual truth. Zack and not Cloud arrive at the reactor where he finds Tifa crouched over her father's dead body. Here she says, "Papa, Sephiroth, did Sephiroth do this to you? Sephiroth, Soldier, Mecha Reactors, Shinra, I hate them all." She then picked up the Masamune, which was lying at her father's side, and ran inside the reactor, with Zack following. Inside, Zack saw Tifa confront Sephiroth, who quickly disarmed her before dealing a grievous blow to her chest and tossing her down the stairs. Zack ran straight by Tifa to confront Sephiroth, but was quickly beaten and hurled from the Genova chamber. Cloud then arrived, retrieved the Buster Sword from Zack, and headed into the chamber. Here, he managed to catch Sephiroth off guard and ran him through with the iconic blade, delivering a devastating injury. He then returned to Tifa, who was completely unconscious, and placed her to one side. Sephiroth, however, emerged from the chamber, badly injured, carrying Genova's head, and a barely conscious Zack prompted him to finish Sephiroth. Cloud then chased after him, but Sephiroth runs him through with the Masamune. Somehow, and to Sephiroth's amazement, however, Cloud found the strength to pull himself down the blade, lifted Sephiroth up in the air, and tossed him into the Mako pool below. In this version of events, it was Zack and not Cloud who heard Tifa's words over her father's body. Tifa never saw Cloud or spoke to him because by the time he got there she was unconscious, and Sephiroth is thrown into the Mako pool. In Crisis Core, Zack arrived at the reactor to find Tifa on the ground, badly injured, but barely conscious. Turning away from him, she said, "I hate you. I hate Shinra. I hate Soldier. I hate you all." He entered the Genova chamber, where he then confronted Sephiroth. Sephiroth, however, ignored Zack and instead removed the mask covering the real Genova. Zack once again challenged Sephiroth and they engaged in battle. Sephiroth gained the upper hand and badly injured Zack, tossing him outside of the chamber. Cloud then arrived and, in the same way as Final Fantasy VII, ran Sephiroth through with the Buster Sword. He tended to an unconscious Tifa outside and watched Sephiroth try to leave with Genova's head. Zack told him to finish it, and this time Cloud is thrown back into the Genova chamber and run through with the Masamune. He again pulls himself down the sword and throws Sephiroth into the Mako pool below before also falling unconscious. Here, as with the original narrative, it is Zack who hears Tifa's words. Tifa remains unconscious throughout Cloud's interactions, therefore never knowing he was there, and Cloud throws Sephiroth into the Mako pool. The real confusion with discrepancies between these two accounts is down to Cloud's inaccurate account during the Kalm Flashback, which is wildly inaccurate. In this account, for example, he recalls Tifa waking up, which she never did, and which she doesn't recall either, hence why she finds his version of events so disquieting. In Remake then, just to clarify, through his headaches, Cloud sees Tifa over her father's body crying and exclaiming how she is sick of this, sick of all of it. And he also sees Sephiroth speaking to Genova, and both of these are what Zack saw, and never Cloud. These are Zack's memories of this event. In Before Crisis, we encounter a few issues, however. In this version, Cloud seemingly never runs Sephiroth through with the Buster Sword, he doesn't pull himself down Sephiroth's blade, and he doesn't throw Sephiroth into the Mako pool. Sephiroth instead jumps in there, kind of randomly and willingly. In Last Order, there is nobody at all around to hear Tifa say Sephiroth, Soldier, Mako reactors, Shinra, I hate them all, and so no memories of this from Zack to be later merged with Cloud's memories. In this version, Tifa actually wakes to acknowledge Cloud and remembers the promise that he made that he would come and save her should she ever find herself in trouble. And this is a massive problem, because the whole point of Tifa questioning Cloud's version of events, which was a core plot point of the entire game, was because she didn't know that he was there during the Nibbleheim incident. And again, Sephiroth jumps willingly into the Mako pool. So again, there are several obvious discrepancies. What we do have to acknowledge, however, is that Before Crisis and Last Order were released pretty much in tandem, and it has since been clarified, thankfully, that these versions of events are not recognised as canon. In the case of Before Crisis, it seems that most of the narrative is canon, and that the Nibbleheim incident was an exception to this. Since it being such an important event, it had to be included, but there needed to be a means by which the player could work through these events, and thus the changes were made. Crisis Core, on the other hand, is not only acknowledged by Square Enix as an official entry into the Final Fantasy VII compilation and its respective storyline, and the events depicted therefore are very much considered canon, but it is also considered to be the most accurate version of the Nibbleheim incident to date. And so yes, for anyone wondering, that means Genesis was there. There is a noteworthy plot point in Before Crisis that explains a previously unaddressed detail, in that Zangan arrives at the reactor searching for Tifa and takes her to safety before the Shinra cleanup crew arrives. This is also in Final Fantasy VII, but it is a missable detail. Shinra's cover-up of this incident was almost complete. Taking the survivors for experimentation purposes, rebuilding the entire town down to every small detail, replacing the townsfolk with actors. But Tifa was an oversight. The player Turk in Before Crisis considers this fact and actually makes a specific point of not telling anyone that Tifa had been there. Upon returning to Nibbleheim later in the game, if the correct steps have been taken by the player, Tifa finds a letter from Zangan hidden within the sheet music on her piano. Tifa, what happened to our town? Was it an illusion or just a dream? No, it was neither. I remember trying to get people out of the flames, but not having the strength. Burning with anger, I went to the reactor to kill Sephiroth, but he was nowhere to be found. Instead, I found you, collapsed inside. I felt saving you was far more important than going after Sephiroth. Several others were still alive inside, but I was only able to save you. As I was coming out of the reactor, Shinra troops were just arriving. I recall a scientist named Hojo was in charge. He ordered the troops to gather up everyone still alive for the experiment. I didn't know what type of experiment he was talking about, but I wasn't about to let them have my dearest student. Putting you on my back, I headed down the mountain to the village. I used the cure spell on you many times, and started to head for Midgar to look for a doctor for you. I don't like that city, but my cure spells weren't helping. I decided to go to Midgar to find a doctor I could trust. I'm worried about you, but I can't settle down in one place for very long. Have you recovered fully? Are you well? I wonder how many years have passed since then. I just got into town again, but I can't believe it. The whole town is normal, except for the strange beings with black clothes all around. The town reeks of Shinra, but I won't go after them. You may think I'm running from them, but it's just that I don't want anything to do with Shinra anymore. Feels like time is running out. I'm sure you'll find this letter and this gift for you. It should come handy. I can't even jump anymore, but I hope you continue to sharpen your skills and remember what I taught you. To my most precious student, from Zangan. The consequences of what happened this day for Tifa in particular are expanded on in A Trace of Two Pasts. Tifa was gravely injured and initially taken to Corel for treatment, but her condition remained unstable. Refusing to take her to a Shinra-financed hospital, Zangan instead took her to a clinic in the Midgar slums, where she had remained in a coma for a full month. When she finally woke, Zangan had already left, and she hasn't seen him since. Her recovery was slow and painful, and subject to significant medical bills. She was cut from her left collarbone to just below her right breast, and part of her breastbone was crushed, which has left her with permanent wiring inside of her body to reinforce the structure of her bones. She was then subjected to skin grafts to minimize the scarring. In the immediate aftermath, the Turks on the scene called for backup to be sent as there were many wounded. Reno and Rude arrived and helped in the village, setting up a medical tent and searching for survivors. Sung went straight to the reactor, and Professor Hojo, upon hearing what had happened, insisted upon going along. You would think Hojo would be devastated. that his prize specimen Jenova had been decapitated, and the head of it now apparently lost, and that he would have at the very least been frustrated also at the loss of his greatest creation, Sephiroth, yet he was not. Not at all. He wasn't fazed in the slightest that his son had just died, only intrigued by the fact Cloud, a nobody, had beat him. It is implied in Final Fantasy VII that Hojo may have deliberately left enough clues at Nibbleheim for Sephiroth to figure out how he came to be, and therefore indirectly set up all of these events. Since seeing Sephiroth in action, his interest in the Jenova experiments had been rekindled, and he had arrived at a theory, which he referred to as reunion theory. In that Jenova's cells, once separated, would always seek to reunite and return to the main body, even if those cells were implanted inside a host body. The minds of these hosts would be influenced to ensure the reunion occurred. The events that played out at Nibbleheim gave Hojo the perfect conditions to test out his theory, as he now had many survivors who Shinra didn't want talking about what happened there, who he could freely test on. Hojo ordered for the survivors to be rounded up for this purpose, and this was the first time we saw the Turks refuse a mission. Reno, Rude, and Sung all said that this work was too dirty even for them, and they wanted no part of it. The Nibbleheim events are covered up nonetheless, and Hojo received his test subjects, including Cloud and Zack. Official Shinra mission logs reported Sephiroth, Zack, and Cloud as all killed in action. In fact, Cloud and Zack and the other survivors were injected with Jenova cells and then exposed to high doses of Mako, a similar procedure to the augmentation done to soldier operatives. Many of the Nibbleheim survivors then died, and the rest did not have the mental or physical strength to withstand the procedure, and became mindless puppets referred to as Sephiroth Clones. These are the black-cloaked figures. Hojo gave each of these a numbered tattoo so he could keep track of them, and later set some of them loose to test out his reunion theory as outlined in the Researcher's Diary No. 4 in Crisis Core. We finally released samples into town. They walk all around town but do not seem to want to leave it. Furthermore, 2 of them are still in their pods. Again, no explanation is provided to me. Could the procedure have failed? The word clone is rather misleading. These are not genetic copies of Sephiroth at all. These people have been essentially infected, which has left them open to being mind-controlled by Jenova through this. Since Zack had already undergone a similar procedure as part of the soldier program, however, none of this had very much effect on him at all. Cloud, however, had never been exposed to anything like this before and developed a severe case of Mako poisoning. One question does arise here. Why would the Shinra company allow Hojo to perform experimentation on Zack Fair, one of their prized first-class soldiers, and with the death of Sephiroth, their only first-class soldier as far as we understand? Shinra had been experiencing challenges with the soldier program for some time, beginning with the mass soldier desertion incident, the Genesis situation, and more recently with reports that Director Lazard had been embezzling company money to fund an attack on Shinra HQ, leaving the entire soldier hierarchy in disarray. Adding to this was the embarrassment of the Avalanche interference, all of which had culminated in a shaken confidence in Shinra by the public. The president considered all of this to be a public relations disaster, and was very keen to win back the trust of the people of Gaia by creating the Space Development Project to launch a rocket into space. It's clear, however, that the company was already making moves to replace the soldier program, as hinted at in a company budget report email that Zack received just before heading to Nibbleheim. After exhaustive engineering by the Arms Development Department, prototypes of the next generation of weapons are feature complete and being tested in the slums. Once mass production becomes feasible, it would enable us to lower human resource costs by drastically cutting down on the number of personnel. With high expectations for these new weapons, we announce the following changes to the budget. Security Department, 7 billion gil, original 10 billion gil. Arms Development Department, 11 billion gil, original 8 billion gil. All of this implies that not only were Shinra keen to ensure Zack would never be able to tell anybody about the events that transpired in Nibelheim, but that Soldier carried far less value to them than it once had. Both Zack and Cloud were deemed as failures and left in the laboratory in the basement of the Shinra mansion. Ironically, it could well be that this procedure actually saved Cloud's life by healing him of the grievous wound caused by Sephiroth. There has always been a question mark surrounding how it was Cloud managed to survive such an attack. Of course, such injuries are possible to be survived, and Final Fantasy VII wouldn't have really worked if Cloud was dead. But the idea that Cloud had some kind of Mako-imbued strength is very much suggested as possible throughout these events, although to date it has been left largely unexplained. They remained captive in the Shinra mansion for 4 years, 2 months, and 17 days, until Zack was able to escape, taking his catatonic friend with him. It then took Zack around 9 months to travel across Gaia, dragging Cloud with him every arduous step of the way before they reached the Midgar wasteland, which accounts for the 5-year time gap which is so often referred to within the Final Fantasy VII story. In the meantime, Sephiroth spent his years travelling through the life stream, his willpower too great to allow him to be consumed by it. All the while, he increased his knowledge and grew in power. The fragments of his broken body eventually congregated in the northern cave inside the North Crater, recreating his physical form inside a cocoon of Mako. From here, he was able to control Jenova's cells as an extension of his own body, and Hojo had certainly provided him with enough hosts to utilize in the form of the Sephiroth clones. Technically, Sephiroth did die at Nibbleheim at the hands of Cloud. Physically, at least. The Jenova cells in his body, however, acted independently, using his body as a host, and his own will was strong enough to remain. His body is kind of dead, but his consciousness kind of alive. It's also explained that anything to do with Jenova is very hard to kill. Lucrezia had also been infused with Jenova cells, and she said that the Jenova inside me won't let me die. So this explains why it was easier for Sephiroth to resist being absorbed into the lifestream. It's implied that initially Jenova was very much in control, which is why the Sephiroth that the party sees on the cargo ship on the way to Costa del Sol, which then mutates into Jenova life, has no idea who Cloud is. But later, Sephiroth's own will was able to supersede Jenova, and by the end of the game, spurred by his hatred of Cloud, it is then very much Sephiroth who is in control. The form of Sephiroth that the party ultimately fight is a combination of the remains of his physical body and of his spirit, or his soul, or his willpower. In The Maiden Who Travels the Planet, Aerith thinks of Sephiroth and knows it was he who had taken over the will of the disaster that fell from the skies, Jenova, which would very much suggest it was indeed Sephiroth in control, even if he was in a state of madness as a result of his connection with Jenova. Katase confirmed this in an interview when he stated that Sephiroth's existence and his will is extremely powerful. There is nothing stronger, nothing above him.